Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, um, and welcome to the panel, Rethinking Nuclear Deterrence, Risks and Alternatives for the second day of International Civil Society Forum to Abolish Nuclear Weapons in Tokyo. And my name is Yuki TOKUDA, and I am a master's student and majoring in nuclear disarmament and gender. And I am going to be a moderator for this session. So nice to meet you. And so the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Putin's irresponsible nuclear sabotaging exposed the world once again the danger of national security strategy relying on nuclear deterrence. So this workshop aims to review risks posed by the current system with experts and will help equip many of us with informative idea that challenges the theory of and practice of nuclear deterrence strategy. With that, I'd like to remind you that this session is being streamed online and the recording will be available later. So for those who are joining us online, you're welcome to join conversation using the Zoom chat function and Q&A session, which happens later for the session. Now, so let me introduce expert. So we have distinguished panelists here for this panel, and I am excited to introduce them and the floor of the panel. So on my left, it is our honor to have our Ambassador Alexander KMENTT and Director of Disarmament, the Control and Non-Proliferation Disarmament at the Austria Foreign Ministry. We will hear from him about the lesson about nuclear retardance risks and limitation, reflecting our recent experiences with Putin's threat of the use of nuclear weapon in the Russian war in Ukraine at first speaker. And for the next speaker, we are glad to have Dr. Tatsujiro SUZUKI, who is a professor and the Vice Director of Research Center for Nuclear Weapon Abolition, RECNA, at Nagasaki University. And following the Ambassador KMENTT perspective from Europe, Dr. SUZUKI will share risks and lessons regarding nuclear deterrence strategy involving nuclear armed and allied states in East Asia. So with insight from both Europe and East Asia, last but not least, I will ask comment from Mr. Daryl KIMBALL, who served as the Executive Director of Washington, D.C.-based think tank Arms Control Association. So after Daryl's comment, I will open the floor to the audience for the question, and we will conclude the session by coming back to the panelists for their concluding thought. So without further ado, I would like to give a floor to Ambassador KMENTT for his remark. Ambassador KMENTT, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Konnichiwa. I think it's important that the international discussion about nuclear weapons focuses now increasingly on nuclear deterrence, because this is really the crux of the nuclear weapons issue. Is it a foundational principle for international security, or is it the opposite, a threat to international security and hence unacceptable? Now, looking at the recent experience in Europe, nuclear weapons have, of course, fortunately not been used in the context of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, but they have been very present throughout the conflict. And the reactions in Europe have been very much dominated by this issue, and much of the public discourse in Europe sees now also a refocusing on nuclear weapons. So Russia has used overt nuclear threats and partly indirect but unmistakable nuclear threats. And of course, the way this was done, this has nothing to do with deterring aggression, which is generally used as a justification for having nuclear weapons, but exactly the opposite. It's been used in the context of an aggression against a non-nuclear weapon states in violation of security guarantees given to this non-nuclear weapon state. So what Russia has done is really not deterrence, but it's coercion and blackmail as a cover for an invasion. So was it successful from a Russian perspective? Russia wanted to prevent NATO from supporting Ukraine. I think there's a mixed picture. So there are, of course, no NATO soldiers fighting in Ukraine. But it's also not clear whether that was the intention of NATO, of doing this. And it's also not clear if it was deterred from doing this because of nuclear weapons. At the same time, NATO has obviously massively supported Ukraine with arms. Clearly, Russia has not deterred NATO from doing this, even though the scale of the military support to Ukraine was calibrated by NATO so not to escalate the conflict too much. So in this sense, most likely nuclear weapons had something to do with it. At the farewell press conference of NATO, former NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, he said, Putin's nuclear threats should not stop NATO from backing Ukraine. It's really interesting because when you think about it, essentially what he says is Russia's nuclear threats don't deter us. So the NATO Secretary General says that NATO is not deterred and that it is seen as a bluff. So it's not sure that nuclear deterrence is even there in the context of Russia's invasion and NATO's reaction. And the obvious lack of success of its nuclear deterrence has led several Russian experts to advocate the need to restore deterrence by using them, concrete using tactical nuclear weapons. So deterrence is supposed to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. So if you have to use nuclear weapons to restore deterrence, this also puts this whole concept on its head. So if and when the war in Ukraine has ended, hopefully, of course, without nuclear weapons being used, I think experts will discuss for a long time what conclusions should be drawn from this. Because I think it's a pretty unclear picture. But what this shows in any case is that there are enormous risks, risk of escalation, there is a fragility, and there is a lot of uncertainty. So how can we respond to these nuclear threats? And here I want to highlight, because of course I'm promoting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, I want to highlight the reaction of TPNW states parties. At the first meeting of the treaty in 2022, TPNW states parties adopted a declaration which contained the strongest condemnation of nuclear threats by any multilateral forum. I quote what states parties said. They said, "We are alarmed and dismayed by threats to use nuclear weapons and increasingly strident nuclear rhetoric. We stress that any use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is a violation of international law, including the Charter of the United Nations. We condemn unequivocally any and all nuclear threats, whether they be explicit or implicit, and irrespective of the circumstances." So this is the strongest condemnation of these threats that we've seen. And to solidify the nuclear taboo, the taboo against nuclear weapons use, it was an inspiration for the G20 statement that followed, which then said the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. It was also an inspiration subsequently by NATO statements and that leaders of China and India and others leaned on President Putin to tone his threats back. I think this was important. But if you go back to the TPNW statements, it says, "We condemn unequivocally any and all nuclear threats, whether they be explicit or implicit." And I think that's also an important point. Because while we are all shocked by the overt nuclear threats that we've seen from Russia, of course, threatening with nuclear weapons is inbuilt into nuclear deterrence. The alleged effectiveness of nuclear deterrence relies on the readiness to use these weapons. And every day, nuclear armed states exercise this, train this, plan this, to signal their readiness to use nuclear weapons, which of course means the readiness to inflict devastating global consequences. So the threat, implicit or explicit, is not an unfortunate byproduct of nuclear deterrence. It's absolutely its foundation. Now, weighing the alleged security benefits of nuclear deterrence, on the one hand, against the existential threat nuclear threats pose for all humanity, that's of course the really important, difficult question. And there are a lot of uncertainties, assumptions, and a precarious balance of mutual threats built into nuclear deterrence. So does this fragile stability of mutual threats is on the one hand, does this justify the global existential threats if something goes wrong? Would the absence of nuclear weapons increase the risk of great power conflicts? And if so, does it make it worthwhile to accept the risks of nuclear annihilation? And of course, who decides such risks? That these risks can be taken, and based on what criteria, and which I think is very pertinent from the TPNW perspective, based on what legitimacy does anybody decide these risks? Or, which is the point of the TPNW, does the prudential principle demand that we urgently remove this existential threat? So the appropriate question, I think, is not to ask whether nuclear weapons can deter, because obviously they can, but whether there is certainty that they will always deter. And the answer to this question is likely to be negative. And of course, we must hope that this discussion remains hypothetical, but as long as it remains hypothetical, there will always be this uncertainty. And I think it should be acknowledged. But absolutely a fact is that nuclear deterrence can fail. That's undisputed. So if nuclear threats are carried through, or there are accidents, we have conclusive scientific evidence that shows what would result, namely catastrophic and likely global and potentially existential consequences. So nuclear deterrence is a psychological and a communicative construct. And it relies on assumptions of stability, of predictability, and of rationality. Nuclear deterrence advocates assume and project behavior and sequences of actions, of intentions, of consequences, and expected outcomes, as if they were controllable. A key uncertainty is the potential for confirmation bias. In assessing the presumed stability provided by nuclear threats, as well as the predictability and the ability to control possible escalation and to avoid miscalculations. So there could be an overconfidence in the stability and predictability about nuclear deterrence. So the notion that nuclear escalation would be controllable under chaotic and stressful conditions of crisis situations, I think needs to be scrutinized much more strongly. Also, claims that nuclear deterrence has prevented large-scale war for the past decades is, of course, based on very limited data. It's based on statistically too short a time period, and it possibly ignores other contributing factors. So the causality between the presence of nuclear threats for the absence of war and nuclear conflict is impossible to prove conclusively. And it may reflect this optimism bias. So the fact that we do not have nuclear war cannot be seen as a proof that nuclear deterrence will always work. Moreover, nuclear weapons have, of course, frequently not deterred aggressions between nuclear armed states, not leading to nuclear war, but aggressions between nuclear armed states. And even they have not, there are cases where they have not prevented non-nuclear weapon states attacking nuclear weapon states, nuclear armed states. So nuclear deterrence theory presents the use of nuclear weapons predominantly as an abstract issue. But the underlying rationale assumes that the credible threat of mutual vulnerabilities will result in mutual restraint and deterrent stability, and not that nuclear weapons will actually be used, or at least not be escalated to nuclear war. So if we look at the concept of mutually assured destruction, even that concept is used primarily as an argument in favor of nuclear deterrence stability. It assumes that the threat with mutually assured destruction will lead that this will not happen. So the details of what it would actually mean in concrete terms for humanity, including the survivors of a nuclear conflict, are not considered. Because there is trust in the steps and in the actions that underpin nuclear deterrence theory, and so that it always leads to avoiding the catastrophic endpoint, which would be mutually assured destruction. So this abstraction is, I think, a big problem. How much time have I split up? 1 minute, okay. Then I'll skip a few things. So nuclear deterrence is also practiced by humans, and it relies on machines and processes that are designed by humans. And of course, this carries within it unpredictable and inherent risks. So no human construct, also nuclear deterrence, no human construct is infallible, just as humans are fallible. Accidents, miscalculations, human or technical error can always happen, must be minimized, but cannot be eradicated completely from the human construct of nuclear deterrence. So given the gravity of the potential consequences, even a low probability of failure translates into an unacceptable high level of risks. So there are undeniable differences between nuclear armed states. We looked at the example of Russia. So the responsibility of nuclear actors is perceived differently. But for the TPNW states parties, I would say that this is not the central issue, because it's the nuclear policies by all nuclear armed states that are based on explicit or implicit nuclear threats that create an aggregated and interconnected set of global existential risks that undermine the security of states, of all states, but also of states not engaged in the practice of nuclear deterrence. So from that perspective, the theory of nuclear deterrence is a highly precarious gamble. And it's one that no government or human being should be entrusted to play. So TPNW states parties have concluded that when you weigh the risks, the uncertainties and possible outcomes of a security paradigm that's based on explicit nuclear threats, leading to potentially global catastrophic consequences, they have concluded that the humanitarian consequences of nuclear explosions are too grave and potentially existential, that the risks of deliberate, inadvertent, or accidental use are considerable and certainly not negligible. And on balance, they conclude that nuclear weapons threaten the security of all, therefore necessitate an urgent move away from this security paradigm. So I think I stop here. Enough already been too long. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor comment. And yeah, you had a strong message that nuclear deterrence is not declared aggression every time. And I think it's an important perspective for nuclear deterrence when we think that. So on my next speaker list, now I would like to turn to Dr. Suzuki. How does the current nuclear deterrence strategy affecting East Asia and how the risks are perceived? So Dr. Suzuki, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have a PowerPoint. My role is to discuss what actually Ambassador KMENTT said. How does what he said is applied to East Asia? I completely agree with him, actually. Next slide, please. I just go very quickly the situation in Northeast Asia. 4 countries, Russia, United States, China, and including North Korea, have nuclear weapons threatening each other. And US, Russia is not talking. China is expanding against United States. But China is the only one country in this region, in fact, in the world, pledged not to use nuclear weapons first. And no force use policy is only China is adopting. North Korea is getting more dangerous. Last year, deciding that South Korea is the first enemy. And Russia and North Korea is now have a so-called comprehensive strategic partnership, which means kind of alliance. So if North Korea is threatened or attacked by any country, Russia may help. And actually, North Korea is sending the troops to Ukraine to help Russia. So this is a new development in this region. Against those threats, South Korea and Japan is strengthening so-called extended nuclear deterrence covered by the United States. And August 2023, Camp David, historic Camp David, US, South Korea, Japanese head of the states agreed to strengthening this alliance relationship. And even South Korea, in the domestic opinion, is in favor of independent nuclear option. Japan maintains non-nuclear principles, but is expanding conventional forces. Basically, all these 3 countries are expanding or strengthening extended nuclear deterrence against those nuclear threats. And this next one, please. This shows how Ukrainian crisis affecting the Japanese public opinions. Whether Japan is going to be involved in the war, the possibility of involved in Japan can be involved in the war is now it's close to 50%. And the most likely enemy is the China, 38%. And the next question is, within 10 years, we talked about 10 years scenario yesterday. Within 10 years, the possibility of nuclear weapon will be used. 59% or close to 60% of Japanese public believe that nuclear weapon could be used in this region. And the last one is relatively positive answer. 72% of the public is still in favor of the non-nuclear principles in Japan, and also 61% still public in favor of TPNW, and also they prefer peaceful solution rather than military action over that's a very positive side. But in any case, Ukraine crisis is increasing the security threats perception in Japan. So given that environment, at RECNA, we started a 3-year project to assess the potential risk of nuclear weapon use in Northeast Asia. The first year, we tried to, we asked the experts, nuclear experts, security experts, Korean Peninsula experts, to get together to discuss possible scenario cases where under what conditions nuclear weapon could be used. And we do not consider probability, but it's any reasonable case or plausible case can be listed. There we have 25 cases developed, and there are 3 common issues identified. The first one, misunderstanding and miscommunication could lead to the forced use of nuclear weapons, unintended use of nuclear weapons. This is very important. Second, the leaders' personalities or military officials' personalities and the thinking, the logical, the brain actually, their characteristics or what they think about the perception of the threat could be very, very important. Doctrine, it may not be work all the time. The third one is after the first use of nuclear weapons, which the military doctrine suggests that will supposed to lead to the end of the conflict, but in the reality, it says, after the first use, nobody knows what's going to happen. Those are the answer of the all security experts we asked for. So the first use of nuclear weapons could lead to any possibility, may end the war, but actually rapidly go into the global nuclear war. So second year, we studied what are the consequences of the nuclear weapon use in this region. Out of 30 cases, we added 5 cases more because of the Ukrainian crisis. Among the 30 cases, we selected 5 cases. Each one of them is a different country to use nuclear weapons first. And they quantify the consequence of nuclear weapons. These are the 5 cases. The first case is used by North Korea. 3 nuclear weapons are used between North Korea and the United States. Second case is first uses by United States and North Korea with China respond. 18 nuclear weapons are used. Third one is terrorists exploded a nuclear bomb in Tokyo. The fourth one is Russia after Ukraine crisis. Actually, Russia is threatened by United States. They believe that they are threatened by United States, so they used first, and the United States responded. 8 nuclear bombs used. The number 5 case is China during the Taiwan crisis. They are threatened to lose the war in Taiwan. They used the first nuclear weapons, and then China, United States respond. Eventually, there will be a nuclear war between US and China, and 24 nuclear weapons are used. And I just want to show only the case 5, which is after the Taiwan crisis, China and the United States involved in the nuclear war. This blue area is covered by the radioactive cloud coming out of the nuclear weapon use. The red dot is where the targets are. And you can see the radioactive cloud cover not only China or East Asia, but it's all covered all Southeast Asia region, even the South Pacific. So the impact will go beyond the conflict area. And also, out of all these 5, next one, please. This is a quantified results of the number of deaths caused by nuclear war, limited to nuclear war. The case 1 and to case 5, there are variations, but if you assess all these regions, roughly 25% of the population will immediately, within a month or so, will die. And if the explosion is either higher or air explosion, then that portion will increase to 35% of people will die. The largest case is case 5, 24 nuclear weapons used. 2.6 million people will die within a month or so. And then the long-term effects is very difficult to quantify estimate the number of deaths in long-term effect. So, but close to 1 million people could increase added for 2.6 million people. So the second year conclusion is the weapon. This is humanitarian concept of nuclear weapon use is quite different from the conventional weapons. Even a small number of people, number of weapons could result in millions of people eventually. At least minimum of 1,000 people, 10,000 people will be die, and also go beyond the affected conflict area. That impact will go affected area, and once it is used, even in a short, even hours or days, the conflict will go into the scale of global nuclear war. And finally, this is important for Japan and South Korea. The most likely weapons used in the nuclear weapons at this moment is not the strategic weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, and the targets are most likely the Allied bases in the region, which means the bases, US bases in South Korea and Japan. So we believe we are protected by the nuclear umbrella, but if the nuclear umbrella fails, we become the first targets. So the third year, we develop a policy recommendations how to prevent such forced nuclear use, and basically we conclude 22 policy recommendations, which is we try to come up with the practical steps. So which means all these list of policy recommendations are once considered by the nuclear weapon states or Japanese government, or once adopted already, but it's abandoned. So it's practically, these are feasible. But there are many cases, and we recommend it, you don't have to follow any one of them, but you can pick out of 22 cases by step. Next one, please. Yes. Warning action, and then mature action, and eventually multilateral reform, 3 steps. And there are many recommendations. One of them, for instance, no force use. And that's one option. And also intermediate nuclear missiles should not be deployed in this region, or that kind of thing. There are many ideas already floating in this already by the security committee. So any recommendation, any policy which can be adopted by any country will be useful to reduce the risk. One of the long-term solution we propose is North Asia nuclear weapon-free zone. Next one, please. This is the idea we propose. It's already 10 years ago. 3+3 concept is Japan and the Korean Peninsula become the nuclear weapon-free zone. Russia, China, and the United States will give a guarantee not to attack these 3 countries with the nuclear weapons, or not to threaten those 3 countries. This kind of concept that we discussed already in the previous session, but hopefully you can read that recommendation we propose. Okay, conclusion, please. So, in order to respond to the threats, military threats in this region, if we try to strengthening the extended nuclear deterrence, that will lead to higher risk of nuclear weapon use in this region. Second, all nuclear weapon states should start dialogue to prevent so-called unintended use of nuclear weapons. Miscommunication and misunderstanding is very tragic, lead to tragic conclusions. So we are recommending a hotline and a dialogue immediately to discuss how to prevent the forced use of nuclear weapons. And also, of course, that will lead to the easing tension in the region. The third recommendation is all these countries should seek the security policies to reduce dependence on nuclear weapons. They eventually shifting towards the security policy, not depending on nuclear weapons. The one of them we propose is nuclear weapon-free zone in the region. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Suzuki. So this simulation is so interesting because the policymakers of the nuclear weapon states think less about the risk and consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. So it was just so important topic. So with that, so let me turn to you, Daryl, for your comment. And as a long-term professional working in Washington, D.C., and I'd like to invite you to share your comment reflecting both view from Europe and East Asia. And if I may add to your intervention, to what extent these risks and alternatives to the current nuclear deterrence strategy are discussed or considered in United States. So yeah, floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador KMENTT and Professor Suzuki. You've put a lot of important concepts and conclusions about the risks and the limits of nuclear deterrence on the table. I just want to start by trying to tie together some of the key bottom line conclusions that I was hearing from both of you about how the recent experience regarding President Putin's threats of nuclear use in Ukraine and the complex web of dangerous deterrence relationships in East Asia, what they tell us about what we need to do to mitigate those risks in the short term. And then I have another issue relating to the what I would call another flawed nuclear deterrence concept I'd like to describe and have each of you respond to. And then last, I want to ask you to comment on one possible approach to moving away from a reliance on nuclear deterrence in a major power relationship. So, I mean, first, I think, Professor Suzuki, you identified in your concluding slide several key lessons that those of us who are interested in mitigating the risks of nuclear deterrence in the near term need to remember. That direct dialogue between nuclear armed adversaries is essential in order to reduce miscommunication, especially in a crisis. We don't have that in all of these different cases. We had limited communication between Washington and Moscow in the fall of 2022, when Vladimir Putin was threatening the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine in order to try to dissuade Ukrainian forces who were at that point overwhelming Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. The other thing that is very important, and Ambassador KMENTT spoke about this, but this is a lesson we need to take in the East Asian context. At the time when Putin's threats were most frequent, which was in 2022, the response of the international community to those threats was critical in moving Putin away from that strategy. It began with the statement that Alex mentioned that came out of the first MSP from the non-nuclear weapon states that which condemned all forms of nuclear threats. That led to the G20 statement that came late that year, which involved China and India, and that was very influential with Putin. So strong statements condemning all forms of nuclear threats as inadmissible is critical to reducing the frequency of those threats, reducing the dangers of this escalatory deterrence strategy. But the other thing I think is an important element in that Russia threats equation that is important for the East Asia context also is that in October of 2022 and before, the United States and NATO did not reciprocate Putin's threats. If they had, it might have been a much, much different situation. And I would just remind everybody that just less than 10 years ago, we had two leaders, one in North Korea, one in Washington, exchanging very explicit nuclear threats against one another. And that made that crisis in the fall of 2017 between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un very severe. That also brought us close to potential conflict in the Korean Peninsula. So refraining from reciprocating threats of use by nuclear weapons state leaders is critical. So those are some important points I just wanted to draw out. But let me come back to an issue that those of us who are working in nuclear armed states or in nuclear umbrella states often encounter. Another flawed nuclear deterrence concept that we see, and that is, and Alex, you mentioned this in passing, states that depend on nuclear deterrence, believe in nuclear deterrence, believe that they need to maintain deterrence, and that if there is a deterrence gap, or if there is a perceived difference in the capabilities vis-a-vis another nuclear armed country, they need to enhance deterrence to deal with that nuclear adversary. So, for example, right now, in response to the forecast that China might increase the size of its arsenal, some members of the U.S. nuclear weapons establishment, leading members of Congress, key advisors in the Trump administration believe that the already massive U.S. arsenal may not be sufficient to deter a growing China and our long-term U.S. nuclear adversary, Russia. Another example, on the Korean Peninsula, we see today some in South Korea arguing that in order to restore deterrence, nuclear deterrence against North Korea, which has a growing nuclear arsenal, South Korea should host U.S. short-range nuclear weapons once again in order to deter North Korea. So how do we deal with such arguments effectively, especially when we're trying to persuade a policymaker or a person who believes in nuclear deterrence theory, who doesn't fully subscribe to the critique that Alex and Professor Suzuki just outlined? So one suggestion I would offer, and I want your reaction to this, is to use the concept of deterrence against those who want to enhance deterrence by building up more nuclear weapons or want new types of nuclear weapons to fill a deterrence gap. We need to point out that, for instance, the United States vis-a-vis China already has far more than what could plausibly be considered necessary to hold targets in China and Russia at risk. The United States has 3,700 some nuclear weapons, about 1,600 nuclear weapons on land-based, sea-based, and air-based systems. Our sea-based nuclear weapons are invulnerable to attack. So no matter how many nuclear weapons Russia has or how many more China has, it is readily apparent that the United States has an arsenal that is more than sufficient to deter Russia or China from using nuclear weapons. As Steve Andreasen, who formerly worked on the National Security Council for President Clinton, said, adding more nuclear weapons will not change the nuclear fundamentals. Nuclear deterrence based on the threat of retaliation in response to a nuclear attack. So the question we should be asking those who argue for more nuclear weapons to create more deterrence is, how would the addition of maybe 500 nuclear weapons change President Putin's thinking? How would it change President Xi's thinking? How would 100 U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea change Kim Jong-un's thinking? The reality is that it wouldn't change their thinking because we already have a massive amount of nuclear overkill necessary, maybe not necessary, but sufficient to deter nuclear use by the other side or try to deter nuclear use. So I'd be interested in your reaction to that argument that we might employ to guard against this, I would say, consequence of nuclear deterrence thinking that can lead to arms racing. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you to respond to is, one concept that has been put forward as a way to move away from a reliance on nuclear weapons by nuclear armed states is that certain types of conventional weapons, especially if they're stealthy, they can be delivered at long range and are very accurate, can substitute for nuclear weapons because they can take out certain types of adversary targets, maybe even nuclear weapon systems. US war planners have been pursuing this strategy for years. And in recent years, the United States has encouraged some allies, particularly South Korea, to develop their own long-range accurate missile systems that are able to strike adversary leadership targets and nuclear targets. So is that a stable approach? Is that a viable approach? Or does that further contribute to the instability and the unsustainability of nuclear deterrence theory? So let me stop there, ask you to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Daryl. So could you please answer the question first?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Of course, very pertinent questions. On the last question, the sort of substitute strategic weapon, so non-nuclear strategic weapon. I mean, obviously, I think from a non-nuclear weapon state perspective, the key critique about nuclear deterrence is that it creates existential risks for the whole planet, for countries that are not party to the conflict, for all humanity, for all living things on this planet. So if you can achieve the same military strategic result without creating these existential risks, that's of course better. Of course, the downside could be that such alternative weapons would then probably be very sophisticated and smart, would then trigger an arms race for those weapons, and in its tail window, wind shadow, nuclear weapons are actually then the sort of poor nations' substitute deterrence, because the technology compared to those smart weapons is easy to achieve. So that could create a sort of double situation, an arms race on the sophisticated weapons, plus actually more pressure for nuclear on the nuclear proliferation side. That's possible. I think, of course, from the existential risk perspective, it is better to move away from nuclear weapons. Then on the other point, of course, it is understandable. It's absolutely a human reaction that if someone threatens, you want to be able to threaten back. But when it comes to nuclear weapons, and this gives the feeling of security, that's absolutely understandable. I think in simple terms, this is what drives this dynamic. But of course, what we also have to consider is that this reliance on threat and counter-threat promotes the whole idea of nuclear weapons being essential. So what is the consequence if we do that? What is the consequence if we do not turn around? It's inevitable, leading to more countries wanting to rely on these weapons. And from a global security perspective, I don't think there's anyone who argue that this trajectory would be good. So we have to try to move away from this. And secondly, when you make the security argument for nuclear weapons, it is based on a very deeply ingrained assumption that rational behavior would follow. So there is an assumption of predictability, but also an assumption of rationality. But of course, if you say that nuclear weapons will lead to rational behavior by all actors, and then at the same time you say nuclear deterrence works because it will lead to rational, that's actually a circular argument. So there are so many assumptions built into this construct that I think the way the discussion has to go is to look at, with all understanding and all acknowledging that we do not know for certain, but looking at these uncertainties, looking at the assumptions, critically assess the risk of bias, and weigh this against what we absolutely do know, that it can fail and what happens if it fails. So it's not, I said that yesterday, it's not a precise science. There are lots of uncertainties. And of course, everybody wants security. But if you really balance the uncertainties, assumptions, the risks now exacerbated by new technologies which add further layers of risk, if you add that, in addition to the knowledge that we have about the consequences and risks globally, what happens? The argument that nuclear weapons are a sustainable basis for security, I think, becomes increasingly untenable. There is no guarantee. I said that I cannot prove or disprove it. So we have to get to the conversation of weighing this. And of course, the countries that do not have these weapons, but are equally subjected to these risks, need to have a say in this. And I think that's part of what is so far completely missing in the nuclear deterrence debate. So there is a fundamentally discriminatory approach in the security discussion about nuclear weapons. And I think that's something that also needs to change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So how about that, Suzuki-sensei?
Thank you. The first question is, US has already enough capability, so they don't have to increase the nuclear weapons capability. I tend to agree with that. But for Japan, for instance, this is so-called reliability of the extended nuclear deterrence. And if that is correct, Japan doesn't have to say, please increase the United States use weapons capability, right? But unfortunately, even if, let's say, a good example is no first use policy. When the United States tried to adopt no first use policy, US has already enough military capability, including conventional forces, and if necessary, they're going to use nuclear weapons. That is already guaranteed. And so no first use does not weaken any US extended nuclear deterrence. That's what the US government is trying to say. But unfortunately, Japanese government at that time, no. When you say no first use, I will weaken the reliability of extended nuclear deterrence. So this is not necessarily the physical evidence of the reliability of the extended nuclear deterrence. It's a perception of the reliability of extended nuclear deterrence. So that's the problem right now for Japan. Yesterday, just actually, Prime Minister Ishibata Putin agreed to ensure the United States will protect Japan, but does not say US will use nuclear weapons. Doesn't say guarantee, right? That's not guarantee. So the problem is that the reliability of extended nuclear deterrence is a perceptual guarantee, not a physical guarantee. That's the problem. The second one, conventional weapons, I think may decrease the dependence on nuclear weapons. That may be possible, but the problem is for Japan, as we discussed, intermediate tactical nuclear weapons, the missiles are dual use. So the United States say, oh, we will not deploy nuclear weapons in Northeast Asia. We only deploy conventional missiles. But for China or North Korea, you never know how we verify it. And if missile is coming from China, coming from Japan, South Korea, you cannot tell whether this is a nuclear warhead or conventional warhead. So even just deploying conventional weapons, that's what the United States said. Again, China, North Korea has no way to verify that it's not a nuclear weapons. And so this is kind of problem of no first use or conventional weapons increase that may not be good enough to substitute or decrease dependence on nuclear deterrence. So I think in our recommendations, we also, of course, recommend that Japan should support no first use dialogue, not just declaration. No first use dialogue between US and China, and also not to deploy guarantee non-nuclear intermediate missiles, nuclear missiles in this region should be discussed again between China and the United States to either verify those two countries.
Thank you for your discussion. So I'm sorry for my timekeeping. We have only now I would like to the open floor for the question, and I'm sorry for my timekeeping. We have only 10 minutes for Q&A session. So if you are in person, please feel free to raise your hand and some stuff bring to some microphone, and yeah. So, and if you are joining online, please use the chat function. So, do you have any question? Yes.
Tom Kono, I'm a fellow of the United Nations Disarmament Research Institute of Disarmament Research, UNIDIO. The wonderful presentation, and also Alex, your original questions and the presentations are very appreciated. But I still feel like this is a conversation between the deaf and one party, one group of people believe in deterrence theory. They do not really understand those people who underlined the risk of enormous consequences used as a result of the use of the nuclear weapons. But just to how we can break this logjam, how can you promote some kind of understanding or dialogue between the two? And just if you give me a little time to just explain for the audience, for the sake of the audience. So the reason I have a 5 or 6 reasons why the people want to keep nuclear weapons or you want to use nuclear deterrence. For nuclear weapon states, they like to prevent another nuclear weapon state from attacking their country. So that's a national security reason. And this is a preventive measure. If you don't have nuclear deterrence, vulnerability is the main problem. Number 2, umbrella states. They really like to feel the threat from nuclear weapon states. They like to have some assurances. And their nuclear allies provide these assurances by promising to retaliate the countries which consider attacking those umbrella states with nuclear weapons. So this is what they want, so why they want nuclear deterrence. And the thirdly, look at the North Korea. They really feel they have this narrow-minded approach to security. They believe the United States, or at least rhetorically, will attack North Korea to change the regime. So they like to have a guarantee for their national security or their regime security. That's why they like to develop a nuclear weapon state. This is the same as Israel too. Fourthly, the post-war European situation. Alex probably know much more than I do. United States has to withdraw millions of troops from Europe after World War II. How to do that? Soviet troops are right there, and they could invade. And conventional weapons will not serve as a deterrence. The only country which had a nuclear weapon is the United States. So that is a kind of replacing preventive measure by the conventional weapons with nuclear weapons. And also, there are other countries which are afraid of disparity created by nuclear weapons, or acquisition of the nuclear weapons. In the case of China, so Russia was the main concern, and Russia first developed the nuclear weapons. Then China did, and India worried about it, and Pakistan worried about it. And in particular, in Pakistan, they have no match conventionally to Russia, but nuclear weapon provide equalizer, so they feel more comfortable. And so this is a comfort level. And Alex just raised the new element or aspect of this nuclear deterrence. As Russia threatened to use nuclear weapons, this previous
Sorry, my
sorry.
name. So we have not enough time. So,
I'm not going to go into that one. So given that, how can you address those countries' concern which want to keep nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence? That's my question.
to whom?
But particularly you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. How to break the logjam in global discussion about nuclear weapons is, of course, it's the very big question. I think to start by acknowledging that it's not that you're right, you're wrong, and I'm right. It's to acknowledge that there are shared security concerns. It's to acknowledge that there are lots of uncertainties. I think to acknowledge the uncertainties is an extremely important part. So we will have progress on nuclear disarmament when the security assessment that nuclear weapons are important for security changes. We are absolutely not there yet. What needs to be done further, I think, is more understanding about what really happens if nuclear weapons are used. So more understanding, more research about the consequences, more understanding about the risks, that this is not a stable system. The assumption that it will remain stable is too fragile. So this is, I think, the way the conversation has to go. Yeah, I wish I knew, yeah, because essentially, if it would be easy, we would have solved this issue a long time ago. I do believe that a more meaningful conversation about juxtaposing the knowledge about the fragility, the knowledge about the consequences and risks against what we believe, or what states that have these weapons believe the security contribution is. That conversation is the only way forward. Yeah, maybe Professor Suzuki has a better answer than me. I think TPNW states parties are offering to have this conversation, and I think that's extremely important for the precarious situation that we find ourselves in, because the alternative is more focus on these weapons, more mutual deterrence relationships with exponentially rising risks. So one conversation at a time.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Thank you. I'm a master's student and majoring in international relations, and especially I'm interested in the situation in Taiwan, related to Taiwan. And I have a question about how to convince those how to say those authoritarian states governor, and because those governors sometimes oppress those civil society and the voice of disarmament of the nuclear weapons, and those authoritarian states are the major actors who expand the number or increase the number of the nuclear weapons. So I think that the most important thing we should do is to convince or dissuade them not to expand their nuclear weapons. So I want to ask, so you expertise how should we address this problem? Thank you.
Could you please answer Suzuki Sensei or the person? Okay.
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. I think let's think about the history. When the United States, the former Soviet Union, agreed for nuclear disarmament, was Soviet Union a democratic country? No. So it is possible that the leaders of the countries agreed to reducing nuclear weapons is beneficial for both countries. It may work. In fact, North Korea once agreed to dismantle all nuclear weapons between the United States and North Korea for a so-called agreed framework, another 6-party talks. So I think this may be a hint. I mean, democracy is more preferable, but it is the United States actually had the largest nuclear weapons threatening for nuclear deterrence. So this is a democratic country, I believe. So I think it's the most important thing is, as Ambassador said, what is the deterrence, risk of deterrence, and how the risk of nuclear weapons? If all leaders agree that having nuclear weapons is more dangerous than reducing nuclear weapons, then people can go for ahead, or countries can go ahead for nuclear disarmament.
Thank you. No? Okay, thank you. So thank you all of your question and active participation in your discussion. So as we are approaching the end of the session, so I would like to invite Ambassador KMENTT and Dr. Suzuki, concluding thought if you have any.
Thanks. I actually want to use that to also respond to that question, if I may. I think it's an assumption that democratic countries would necessarily be less likely to use nuclear weapons. I think we hope that that's the case, but I don't think we can assume that. What is definitely the case is that in democracies with vibrant public discourse and civil society, there is a way of engaging governments which you cannot do as easily in autocratic countries. So you obviously have there are more opportunities, there are more ways to have this discourse about nuclear weapons in democratic countries. And I think that's the only way how you change attitude towards nuclear weapons, by broadening the discussion. And since the nuclear threat perceptions among countries that have these weapons are mutually reinforcing, obviously by starting in democratic countries to change the perception about nuclear weapons, you invariably also will have an impact. So it's clear that no country, no nuclear weapon states will unilaterally throw away its weapons and be naked and say, please don't hurt me. That's not how it's going to work. It's moving away from salience of nuclear weapons, which will have to be done through a collective reassessment of the security benefit of nuclear weapons, in light of the mounting body of evidence that no use of nuclear weapons can ever be acceptable, nor can it be lawful, because the consequences are likely to lead to escalation and suicidal and genocidal outcomes. So that's where we have to go to. So I think also the argument that's often used against the TPNW, that it sort of focuses on democratic countries. It focuses on nuclear weapons, it focuses on the weapon, and it wants to have a discussion about these weapons, what they do, how risky they are, and what conclusions should be drawn, which obviously is easier to have in democratic countries, and change is likely to come from democratic countries, because actually that's the strength of democratic systems. Thank you.
My first comment is even if you believe in nuclear deterrence only works under certain conditions. One of them is to have a mutual understanding of each country's will. If there is no communication, very difficult to certain that the nuclear deterrence works. So the first thing I would like to recommend is, of course, try to come back or the dialogue between nuclear weapon states to make sure they understand each other to prevent first use of nuclear weapons. So maintain nuclear taboo, not to use nuclear weapons, is the first top priority at this moment. Second, for Japan, the South Korea, nuclear umbrella is a very, very misleading word. There is no physical umbrella. Extended nuclear deterrence does not guarantee the nuclear weapon states will use nuclear weapons to protect us. And if it fails, we will become the first target. So I think nuclear umbrella, the word nuclear umbrella should be abolished. Actually, this is very dangerous, actually. That's my second point. Third point, there is an alternative to nuclear deterrence, which is common security, mutual dependence. We have a wisdom to get away from nuclear deterrence. So I think the role of civil society and our experts also should push forward this real positive, practical alternative to nuclear deterrence. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So with that, I would like to close this panel. So please join me for thanking the esteemed panelists for sharing their insight and speech. And so I hope this panel was rich discussion and thought-provoking to consider how to overcome and break the current status quo without heavily relies on the deterrence. So I am sure it became an opportunity to renew our commitment to keep working together for all of us. So thank you very much again for joining the panel, both in person and online. And I look forward to the next opportunity. So thank you very much.